The event which shaped the year began in 1979. Soviet troops had started to move into Afghanistan at Christmas. Moscow claimed they'd been invited, but for most people, it was simply an invasion. Along with the invasion, a coup d'etat that installed Babrak Karmal as Afghan president. He was Moscow's man, using Soviet troops alongside the Afghan army to impose order. They met fierce resistance. In the mountains, Muslim tribesmen pledged a fight to the death against Karmal's communist regime and the invading superpower that supported it. The tribesmen had always been divided among themselves, but they did unite enough to pose a challenge to the Soviets throughout the year. Against primitive rifles, Moscow poured in modern hardware, including tanks and helicopter gunships. They blasted the guerrillas' mountain hideaways, but they didn't stop the resistance. Afghans said poison gas was used, but the claim was generally considered not proven. There were certainly atrocities on both sides, and the casualty toll was high. The fighting sent thousands of civilians fleeing into neighboring Pakistan, but beyond their individual misery, the world outside was desperately worried. Were the Soviets abandoning détente in favor of expansionism? America imposed economic sanctions and put the Arms Limitation Treaty on ice. The outlook was gloomy, and it didn't brighten much as the year progressed. The anxiety was measured in grams of gold. Actually, gold fever wasn't entirely due to Afghanistan, but it certainly got a boost from it. In Europe, family treasures went into the melting pot as gold topped $800 an ounce, with silver too booming. A different search for gold and silver, the Winter Olympics, but these too happened in the shadow of Afghanistan. President Carter decided to let the Lake Placid Games go ahead, and in the end, they were good ones. The Russians won the medals race, but there were many individual triumphs. Someone else who skated home to victory, Canada's Pierre Trudeau. He came out of retirement to crush Joe Clark, who ruled for just 6 months. The year's other major comeback was in India, where Mrs. Gandhi confounded her critics with a massive win after more than 2 years in the political wilderness. Back too was her younger son, Sanjay. He looked set for even greater power and influence as India's unofficial crown prince. But after politics, Sanjay's passion was flying. And in the air, as in politics, he paid scant attention to the rules. In June, his light plane crashed in Delhi, killing him and his instructor. He'd been flying too low. His death shattered his mother and halted a meteoric career. Friends and enemies alike knew Sanjay could have changed India. There was a move to replace him, but elder brother Rajiv was in no hurry to leave his chosen career, flying planes. In the Middle East, a major achievement in archaeology. After years of backbreaking labor, the temples of Philae in Upper Egypt emerged on their new site, away from the floodwaters of the Aswan Dam. Politically, though, progress was patchy. In January, Israel pulled out of a large slice of occupied Sinai and handed it back to Egypt. The Camp David plan seemed to be working. The following month, the two arch-enemies exchanged ambassadors for the first time since Israel's creation, but that's where things stuck. Among the difficulties were self-rule for the Palestinians, Israel's settlements on the West Bank, and its claims to an undivided Jerusalem. In Turkey, a military takeover in September ended a spiral of violence from left and right. Colonel Kenan Evren and his fellow officers claimed it was no ordinary coup, just a temporary move to preserve Turkish democracy. In Yugoslavia, President Tito died in May after a long illness. Alive, Tito had personified Yugoslavia. And with the grief, there were fears that the nation's independent line might not survive his passing. But it did. Elsewhere in Eastern Europe, though, there was less continuity. In Poland, strikes brought a halt to shipyards in the north and mines in the south. Workers locked themselves in as relatives and the world watched almost in disbelief. The workers wanted more pay, more food, more freedom. Above all, the right to strike and form their own trade unions. Led by Lech Wałęsa, they won all their demands. In the process, they sandbagged the economy, dislodged the premier, outstared the Communist Party, and set alarm bells ringing all over the Eastern Bloc. It was practically a revolution. In Western Europe, a new queen. Beatrix, the daughter of Queen Juliana, proudly took the throne of Holland in April, after her mother had stepped down. A happy day, but not for everyone, as demonstrators outside drew attention to the plight of Holland's homeless. Violence of a different sort in Italy, where a bomb planted in Bologna railway station created the worst single atrocity in peacetime Europe. 85 were killed, over 100 maimed. It was one of several bombings in Europe, all blamed on right-wing extremists. In a Paris synagogue, 4 dead, a dozen injured. In West Germany, too, a bomb at Munich's October Beer Festival claimed 13 lives. It happened only days before elections, which opposed Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and challenger Franz Josef Strauss. Schmidt won in what was seen as a victory for moderation. Britain, too, saw violence. In Iran's London embassy, Arab gunmen held 21 hostages, most of them Iranians. They killed 2 hostages, then Britain's crack SAS regiment took a hand as the nation watched on TV. An SAS grenade distracted attention as others stormed the hostage room. 3 gunmen died in a hail of SAS bullets. In Iran, the 52 American hostages completed a year in captivity. Washington tried threats, pleas, and economic sanctions, but nothing budged the Iranians. In April, President Carter decided to act. He gave the go-ahead for a bold plan to snatch the hostages to safety, but it fell in ruins when a rescue plane and helicopter collided in the desert at Tabas, far from Tehran. There weren't enough spare helicopters, so the mission was abandoned, amid doubts it could ever have succeeded. 8 Americans died in the attempt. Iranians gloated, but they were to face bigger challenges. In September, the border feud with Iraq erupted into open warfare. The Iraqis' goal was territory. Their main onslaught was in the south, against Khorramshahr and Abadan with its refinery. Iraq had expected a quick and easy victory, but the Iranians resisted and they struck back hard at Baghdad. It wasn't just petroleum that went up in smoke. The war destroyed homes and created hundreds of casualties on both sides. It set Muslim against Muslim and stirred embers of racial hatred. It didn't even succeed in unifying the Arab world, and as the year ended, there wasn't a winner in sight. In Africa, a war ended. Guerrillas came in from the bush as Rhodesia prepared to become independent Zimbabwe. It was no easy step from civil war to multiracial democracy, but with a little help from British bobbies, elections were fairer than most people expected. The result was a clear victory for Robert Mugabe's ZANU party. Mugabe had been feared as a fire-breathing revolutionary, but he emerged as a moderate leader who faced serious challenges in the economy and internal security. In South Africa, no revolution, but elements of a guerrilla war. Black extremists hit a major oil from coal plant in June. It was well planned and executed, a key event in a year which showed black anger rising steadily. There were violent clashes with the police, especially over unequal opportunities in schooling, clashes that left victims. Behind the scenes, important political changes could mean a better deal for non-whites in the future. But judging from 1980, the government still has a lot of persuading to do. In Liberia, Samuel K. Doe rose from Master Sergeant to President. It happened in April after Doe staged a bloody coup that killed President Talbot and many of the country's ruling elite. In Uganda, former President Milton Obote flew back home 9 years after the coup that toppled him. He came to celebrate the overthrow of Idi Amin and take part in elections to regain the presidency. He found a nation in crisis, not all of it political. In the northern province of Karamoja, thousands were starving to death in a dry and dusty hell. The tragedy wasn't confined to Uganda. South of the Sahara, drought hit 126 million people in 26 nations. In Asia, relief supplies were actually a cause of further suffering. Western food aid to Kampuchea was intended for starving peasants and refugees, but some went to Khmer guerrillas who were fighting the Vietnam-backed government in Phnom Penh. To cut the aid, Vietnam attacked in June, a brief but bloody onslaught that left many dead and injured. On the border, the daily problems of relief and security fell to Thailand. For the world outside, the problem was who should represent this shattered people at the United Nations. Meanwhile, the Kampuchean tragedy rolled on. And though Vietnam did much to combat famine, the country's richest harvest was still human misery. Elsewhere in Asia, the premiers of Japan and China both made news. Chinese Premier Hua Guofeng lost his office in China's steady drift away from Maoism. Japanese Premier Ohira was all set for a tough election battle when he died suddenly, just 10 days before the vote. It was a personal tragedy, but it healed the divisions of his party, which won the elections and emerged stronger than ever under new leader Zenko Suzuki. Among the year's other deaths, the former Shah of Iran. His tragic exile ended in Egypt, where he died of cancer. President Sadat gave him a state funeral, but world leaders stayed away. One mourner, though, was former President Richard Nixon. The film world lost Peter Sellers. His friends mourned a complex, often serious man. His fans a brilliant clown. Another loss, tough guy Steve McQueen. He was fighting cancer, but died in October of a heart attack. A month later, it was Mae West. Hollywood's most durable legend was snatched away in her prime, aged 87. 1980 was the year of the traveling Pope, as John Paul II crisscrossed the world. He began in Africa with the Congo, Zaire, and Kenya. In Europe, France, and later Germany. But the welcome was never noisier than in Brazil, where millions followed his every step. The message they heard, sympathy and support for the oppressed, but no justification of violent revolution. Elsewhere in Latin America, the church was dragged into the center of revolution. Archbishop Romero of El Salvador was gunned down in a hospital chapel. He'd never preached violence, but he'd been a figurehead for the oppressed, and his death was a crushing blow. Worse was to follow. At his funeral, gunmen from left and right packed the crowd. Shooting broke out, and the ceremony of grief turned into a further orgy of bloodletting. Over 30 died on this day alone. Total deaths for the year were well over 5,000, making this the world's bloodiest revolution in progress. In Bolivia, coup number 189 unseated the world's only woman president. Lydia Guayler was ousted in July by her cousin, General Garcia Meza, who took the country into increasing political isolation. It went the other way about in neighboring Peru, where democratic elections restored President Balaún de Terry, the man the military toppled 17 years ago. A vote, too, in Chile, but it postponed democracy. President Augusto Pinochet promised 8 more years of autocratic rule, and his supporters loved it. In Argentina, recognition for a man opposed to autocracy. Adolfo Esquivel Pérez won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts on behalf of human rights. In the Caribbean, an autocrat decided to share his life, if not his power. Jean-Claude Duvalier, Haiti's president for life, got married in May. Elsewhere in the region, democracy was no guarantee of order. Election time in Jamaica was a violent finish to a year in which over 500 died. It ended in crushing defeat for left-wing Premier Michael Manley. He'd claimed he'd been beaten by the Western economic system.
On election day.
It was certainly an economy in crisis he handed to successor Edward Seaga. Seaga ended the Marxist revolution in Cuba and moved nearer to the United States, a major shift to the right in Caribbean politics. Cuba had its own problems, but for those who wanted to leave, it wasn't easy at first. Then Castro suddenly opened the doors, and Cubans headed for Miami in their thousands. Most were genuine immigrants, but many had criminal records or personality disorders. America accused Castro of simply dumping his undesirables. And when the exodus ended in September, it was at Washington's request. America, of course, was busy finding a new president. Up and running early was Teddy Kennedy. But in 1980, the Kennedy name was no magic password to the White House, and Teddy's challenge failed. The president faced other problems. Brother Billy didn't help by getting involved with the Libyans.
Are you in any way embarrassed or...
In the campaign, John Anderson was an irritant to Carter, not a challenge. But the tide was turning away from both of them. America was moving to the right, and that made Ronald Reagan look like a man whose time had arrived. In a tough campaign, his blunders were jeered at, and he was dubbed warmonger and racist. But he came up smiling. The president fought hard because he entered the campaign late, trailing. He pulled up quickly, but it was not just Ronald Reagan he was fighting. It was inflation, unemployment, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and his own record. Powerful opponents, and in the end, they overcame. Reagan's victory wasn't a complete landslide. He was only 10% ahead on the popular vote, but it was a solid mandate for a change of direction.
I am not frightened by
by what lies ahead, and I don't believe the American people are frightened by what lies ahead.
America had other upheavals too. In Washington state, the volcano on Mount St. Helens erupted in May like this. Damage was widespread and dozens died. A disaster, but it was worse in Algeria, where the town of El Asnam was shattered by a massive earthquake, the second in a quarter century. The toll, 250,000 homeless and over 2,600 dead. Italy also suffered. A series of quakes in November shook vast areas of the south. The death toll was again in the thousands as village after village was destroyed. Whole families disappeared. For those who survived, the question on their lips and in their eyes was, why us? Around the world, weather caused its usual havoc, with hurricanes in the Americas and typhoons in Asia. This was Manila in July. Still, someone enjoyed it. This too was Manila. In March, it needed quick work from firemen and emergency services to cope with this crashed Boeing from China. Miraculously, only 2 died and over 130 were saved. The year's other major air crash was in Tenerife. All 146 on board perished as this chartered jet approached Los Rodeos Airport, scene of the world's worst ever crash in 1977. The airport's now been closed for good. In space, a year of achievement. The Soviet Union sent up several foreign crewmen to visit the orbiting Salyut 6 space station. And in October, Soviet cosmonauts Valery Ryumin and Leonid Popov notched up a world record for the longest stay in space, 185 days. America's triumph came with the Voyager spacecraft. Its snaps of Saturn revealed many surprises, including more rings than anyone had imagined. Back on Earth, as fuel got dearer, cars got smaller and smaller. This German creation took the world record in October, a staggering 3,000 miles per gallon. Even better fuel economy and another world record. In Brighton, England, they reached over 50 miles an hour in the sort of pollution-free motoring where exhaust has a whole new meaning. One pedaling Frenchman headed for the record books this way. Once started, he never looked back, forward. And in Germany, believe it or not, they just couldn't get enough of snuff. It'll never make the Olympics. In 1980, though, the Olympics themselves nearly didn't happen. Because of Afghanistan, the Summer Games in Moscow were boycotted by America and 65 other nations. They weren't a fiasco, but the number of absentees stamped a question mark on every winner's medal. There were other Olympics, though. In June, handicapped athletes from all over the world met in Arnhem, Holland. In a year that saw many disputes and divisions, theirs was one achievement that simply couldn't be questioned. Winners, every one.